I want to get into this real quick because it was the game of the weekend and it came at a perfect time. Football season was over. The masses were turning their attention to college basketball. Number one, number two, the biggest game in the history of the state of Alabama, Auburn at Alabama. Auburn comes away with the win. They really solidified themselves, in my opinion, as the number one team in college basketball right now. What did we learn about Bruce Pearl's club, if anything, this weekend?
I think they have the best player on the floor in that game. That was pretty clear. Janai Broome versus Mark Sears was a big discussion in preseason circles, and I think that discussion is pretty much over. And then the other thing, too, that I think that they've really found is just the variety of offensive skill and talent that they have. I think of one play late in that second half where Alabama goes on this big run to Hod Pettiford, comes down in transition right in front of his bench and drills a three with no one there for offensive rebound. Like, the fearlessness, the ability to score at multiple levels. I talk about a lot. This Auburn team has catch and shoot snipers and off the dribble snipers and elite rim offense. So like when you could do all of those different things really, really well, that adds a different strategy to it. And I think that this group looks, on pace to be an all-time team. And Alabama has some soul searching to do. I think Auburn is a lot closer to that perfect level of like elite team in college basketball. They kind of have the UConn script, right? Where they can score in so many different ways. Oh, and they have elite rim protection too defensively. Like that's what UConn did on the way to the title. Auburn's doing that even better this year at so many ways. So I was blown away by the Tigers. I think that when they are motivated and when they don't get bored, like they're almost unbeatable.
It's very interesting. You mentioned UConn. I think the biggest difference between last year's UConn team and the last two UConn teams and this year's Auburn team is when UConn needed a bucket, they ran something and they got a slip, they got a back cut, they got somebody off a stagger, Jordan Hawkins a couple of years ago. Like they were calling a set and they were manufacturing the shot out of their playbook. When Auburn needs a bucket, to your point, they pull up for three in transition. Like Bruce Pearl lets his guys go. And that's not to say they're not organized, but there's a level of freedom and trust that he really allows his players to play with. And I'm fascinated to see how that pans out in a scenario where you've got to win 6 games. What do you go to if all of a sudden the shots aren't falling as easily? Do you have something in the playbook you can go to? Sort of like Villanova did back in the day. They were big into their principles, not as much their sets, but every once in a while, Jay Wright had something in the playbook. So that's something that I'm gonna look forward to seeing as February turns to March and maybe even April here. The other big win of the weekend I thought was Houston at Arizona. They go in and they take that win. And to me, what was really a game that the Wildcats needed to win if they hope to have a shot to catch the Cougars in the race for the Big 12 championship. As we look at this Houston team, I'm not sure that most fans recognize just how high their ceiling is. And I think that may be because they don't have that one name. There's no Marcus Sasser. There's no Jamal Shed, who we just, kind of identify as the focal point of that team. But compare this year's Houston team to some of the other great Houston teams we've seen in recent years for me.
Well, it feels like the last few years injuries have really marred the late season part of Houston basketball. Like if you're turning in just to March to see Houston, maybe they don't blow you away because they've been injured. They've lost a lot of guys the last couple of years. This year they're healthy. And, I said it before, like even though Jamal Shed is gone, I think this backcourt is better. Like Milos Uzan is playing at a really, really high level right now. His touch on that little floater is terrific. He's shooting over 40% from three. You already know what you're getting from Emmanuel Sharp and LJ Cryer, who are just snipers, but they've found really nice additional secondary pieces from Terrence Arsenault has been really good. Malik Wilson has been really solid. And they just come at you in waves offensively. And I think this Houston team has a little bit more of a path to a deep run because these guards are legit. And I think Juwan Roberts has really turned a corner here lately as well, like as a mismatch hunting four who can pretty much go toe-to-toe with anybody. And it doesn't look great all the time with some of these like off-foot left-hand runners, but they go in at a high enough clip. And it's just a kudos to Houston being able to mix, that toughness and like, hey, all of our defensive principles that we're going to do well, also with the skill and shooting that we know like you have to have in an era of college basketball where scoring is just ballooned.
We now have 26 days before Selection Sunday, and in my opinion, the biggest story in each of those 26 days is going to be the bubble watch. I think that's what if you're not tuning into this until March, you are missing out, because I think it's the hunt for these final spots that is almost as exhilarating as the tournament itself. And to that end, we saw a lot of notable games this weekend, and quite frankly, a lot of notable losses. I mean, the bubble teams fighting for survival: Georgia, SMU, Kansas State, and Villanova. They all took losses this weekend, Trotter. For Georgia, it was a loss at home to Missouri, 87-74. Now, let's start with them, because correct me if I'm wrong or if you see this differently, but to me, they're on the bubble and they've got to get a win, a notable win, away from their home floor to feel good on Selection Sunday.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think the SEC is just completely brutal this year, where it's like, all right, like you've dealt through like, hey, here's Missouri, right? Who was playing like maybe a tier 2 national title contender. Finally, we get through that. What do we got next? Oh, it's Auburn and Florida, who are maybe 2 of the best 3 teams in college basketball this year. Like, it's just brutal to be a bubble team. Now, the one underrated part about Georgia's resume, I think that's underrated, is that conference record is not on the team sheet. They could easily finish 6-12 in the SEC this year, because the SEC is that good of a league. That's a historic league. It's not on the team sheet. So I think like the next 2 games, like if Georgia can win one of these next 2, whether that's Auburn or Florida, find a way to pull one of these bigger upsets, I think they'll feel really good on Selection Sunday, because like this league is just a bear, and I think they're going to get a little bit of a shadow of doubt too. Like also the non-conference win over St. John's has aged pretty darn well for the Bulldogs as well too.
Yeah, it's a fair point. I will say this. I'm candidly not expecting them to win either of these games, but I look at the last 3 games of their regular season. That game at Texas, because those are 2 teams that may be considered on the bubble, that's going to be a huge game. Georgia at Texas. They've got to win at South Carolina. And then Vandy's another game on Georgia's home floor. That's going to be another game that could be construed as 2 teams on the bubble. So I look at those 3, even if they fall to Auburn and Florida, like those last 3 are make it or break it. But again, SMU Wake, it was a huge win for Wake. Not so, big loss for SMU, a team that could conceivably finish with 24, 25 wins in the regular season and maybe not even get into the field, based on just the fact that they don't have any great wins by the metrics so far. Kansas State, not a good weekend, losing back-to-back road games at BYU and Georgia, and then Villanova falling at Providence. That was a big loss for them. Even Oklahoma, I thought, losing at home to LSU. That was brutal as well. But the bubble watch is going to continue to be the talk of college basketball here for the next 3 or 4 weeks, all leading up to Selection Sunday. We're going to have lots more content. You know where you can find it, over on 247sports.com. Not just college basketball, but all your recruiting rankings, all the intel, team-by-team coverage, transfer portal updates. We know that's coming. 247sports.com is the place to be for all your college basketball and recruiting needs.